the fog over the harbor. The morning sun over Los Angeles had a way of cutting through the coastal mist with gentle persistence, turning the gray haze of the Pacific into a quiet wash of gold. High above the bustling avenues, in an office that smelled of seasoned leather, freshly brewed black coffee, and old law volumes, Barnaby Jones sat comfortably behind his polished oak desk. He was a man of steady habits and unshakable patience, wearing his years with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen every corner of human nature and still chose to believe in its goodness. Across from him, Jedediah Jones, known to everyone simply as JR, was wrestling with a thick textbook bound in dark blue cloth. JR was bright, earnest, and occasionally overwhelmed by the endless labyrinth of legal definitions required to pass the state bar examination. Substantive law defines the content of the norms of behavior that are to be legally enforced, JR recited, closing his eyes tightly and rubbing his temples as if trying to physically press the words into his memory. The content of the norms of behavior that are to be legally enforced. An adjective law governs the procedure. Oh boy, it seems like an endless mountain of words you have to memorize just to earn the right to stand up in a courtroom. Barnaby looked over the top of his reading glasses, a warm, grandfatherly smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Well, if it helps to keep your spirits up, son, you can just keep thinking about all those handsome fees you'll be able to charge honest clients once you pass that bar exam. And think of all the grand things you will be able to spend them on. Beautiful yachts, fast motor cars, world travel, and fine dinners. JR chuckled, setting the heavy volume down on the corner of the desk with a sigh of relief. Now that is a philosophy I can get behind. Though I have to say, your line of work does not look half bad today either. You open your morning mail, and what do you find? Real money just sitting inside an envelope. Betty Jones, carrying a tray with 2 fresh cups of steaming coffee, walked into the room. Her expression was bright and observant. She set the cups down and looked at the envelope lying on the blotter. The letter was unsigned, neatly typed on crisp paper, and contained $195 in crisp green bills. An unsigned letter, JR mused, leaning forward with sudden enthusiasm, his legal fatigue instantly forgotten. Somebody emptied out their piggy bank to hire a private investigator. To me, the whole scenario is as clear as day. It is a damsel in distress, sending a silent, noble plea for help. Barnaby took a slow sip of his coffee and looked at JR with an amused twinkle in his eye. You know, JR, there is one profession you should probably stay far away from. And what would that be? JR asked, grinning. Well, it is certainly not the law, Barnaby remarked dryly. Betty picked up the sheet of paper and read the brief, urgent lines aloud. Dear Mr. Jones, a man named John Stevens has disappeared from his job at the Farinelli Freight Company pier. I hope this money is sufficient to employ you to investigate the matter. JR straightened his jacket, clearing his throat playfully. All right, let me give you a complete thumbnail sketch of the sender. If I get it right, I get to take the lead on the legwork, deal? The sender is almost certainly a woman.
Why?
Because when people are in deep trouble and do not know where else to turn, they reach out with hope rather than pride. Furthermore, consider the piggy bank aspect. It is precisely $195, not a neat $200. That tells us it is someone who works hard for every penny and finds it difficult to make ends meet, yet gave every spare dollar she had in the world. Betty raised an eyebrow, smiling softly at his deductive vigor. Not bad, JR, though your reasoning has a few leaps. Barnaby took the letter from Betty and held it up toward the warm morning light. Notice the typing. The alignment is perfectly spaced. There are no strikeovers, no corrections, and no misspelled words. She is clearly a proficient typist, likely an office secretary or a clerk. And look at the watermark on the bond paper. It is high-quality commercial paper, but the company letterhead at the top has been carefully trimmed off with a pair of scissors. The typeface comes from a standard manual office machine, not a modern electric one. The odds are 5 to 1 that our sender works in an office connected to that very freight company. Betty leaned in, thoughtful. But Barnaby, why would someone pay $195 hard-earned dollars to hire a private detective for a missing warehouse worker when they could simply call the police missing persons bureau for free? Barnaby nodded slowly, setting the paper down beside the stack of bills. And that, my dear Betty, is the $195 question. It means whoever wrote this letter is afraid of what the official authorities might uncover, or afraid for someone they love. Down at the waterfront, the morning mist was thicker, carrying the rich scent of brine, diesel fuel, and damp timber. Farinelli Freight operated from Pier 14, a vast network of corrugated steel warehouses, wooden loading docks, and towering cargo cranes. Inside the quiet office of the main warehouse, Lee Wallace stood near the window, his jaw clenched as he watched the docks. Lee was a man who had grown up on the rough side of town, sharp-eyed and practical, but burdened by choices that had slowly led him into deep waters. Beside him stood Tom Landry. Tom was a tall, broad-shouldered young man with an honest, open face and gentle brown eyes that held a persistent trace of innocence. A few years earlier, while serving his country overseas, a landmine had detonated beneath his vehicle. Tom had survived, but the severe concussion had left him with an injured memory and a mind that sometimes struggled to piece the present together. He was as strong as an ox, but had the gentle heart of a child, utterly devoted to his wife, Peggy. "Look, I am scared, Lee," Tom whispered, his fingers fidgeting nervously with the hem of his canvas jacket. "What if Mr. Farinelli does not want to give me a job? What if he thinks I am not smart enough?" Lee turned and placed a firm hand on Tom's shoulder, his expression softening with genuine affection mixed with guilt. "Tommy, have I ever let you down? We grew up together on the same block. I told you I would look after you, and I will. Everything is going to be fine. Just let me do the talking." A moment later, the inner office door swung open, and Mr. Farinelli walked in. Farinelli was an immaculate, soft-spoken businessman who wore expensive wool suits that seemed entirely out of place among the greasy dockyard crates. Behind him lurked Eddie, a quiet, cold-eyed enforcer who moved with quiet menace. "Good morning, Mr. Farinelli," Lee said smoothly. "I brought Tom Landry, just like I mentioned." Farinelli looked Tom up and down with polite curiosity.
"Ah, yes.
Tom Landry. Eddie and I were just finishing a discussion about that unfortunate business with John Stevens the other evening." Lee stepped forward slightly, shielding Tom. "As I told Eddie, Stevens was skimming cargo, and when I confronted him, he caused a disturbance. It is completely settled now. We do not have to worry about Stevens. He was a loner." Farinelli smiled thinly, his hands resting on his gold-headed cane. "You know it is my nature to worry, Lee. Especially when valuable shipments of uncut gems from overseas are involved. But I understand you and Tom were childhood friends. Loyalty is an admirable quality, even if it is sometimes complicated in business." Tom stepped forward, offering an earnest, eager handshake. "Mr. Farinelli, my wife Peggy works in your front office. I really want to thank you for giving me a chance to earn an honest wage on the pier. I am strong, and I can lift whatever needs lifting." Farinelli shook the young man's hand gently. "You are very welcome, Tom. Peggy is a wonderful employee, and we are glad to have you with us. Why don't you wait outside by the gate while Lee finishes up the paperwork?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir," Tom said happily, his face brightening as he stepped out into the crisp sea breeze. Once the heavy door clicked shut, Farinelli turned his cold gaze back to Lee. "The young man seems completely harmless, but he carries an unpredictable simplicity. Eddie will be spending the next few days down on the pier with you, just to make sure all of our operations remain perfectly orderly." "Understood," Lee murmured, though his stomach knotted with tension. Out near the loading bays, Peggy Landry was seated at a small wooden desk, organizing shipping manifests and cargo declarations. She was a woman of remarkable grace and quiet resilience, whose deep love for Tom was visible in the patient gentleness of her eyes. When Tom walked over, beaming with pride, she could not help but smile. "Peggy, look," Tom said softly, leaning over her desk. "Mr. Farinelli gave me the job. Steady work. Real wages." Peggy reached up and took his large, calloused hand in hers. "Oh, Tom, that is wonderful news. But you have to promise me you will be careful. No heavy lifting that strains your back, and no getting into arguments with anyone." I promise, Peg. Hey, let us celebrate tonight. Real steak and sparkling cider. How about we wait until you receive your first full paycheck at the end of the week? She suggested with an affectionate laugh. Then we will have the finest dinner in town. While Tom went over to the supply shed to collect his work gloves, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair and a warm, observant gaze walked into the pier office. He tipped his hat courteously to Peggy.
Good morning, ma'am.
My name is Barnaby Jones. I am a private investigator, and I am looking for a gentleman named John Stevens. I understand he has been employed here on the docks. Peggy kept her hands perfectly still on the desk, though her heart gave a sudden leap. Well, yes, Mr. Stevens was on our payroll, but he has not reported for work since last Thursday. Did he happen to call in or leave any word with his supervisors? Barnaby asked gently. No, he did not call. He started working here about 6 months ago. Before that, he was in the Merchant Marine. He had no family listed on his emergency card. Barnaby took out a small pocket notebook and a fountain pen. Did anyone from the company make an inquiry to see if he was ill or in need of assistance? No, Peggy replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. It is not entirely unusual for single dock workers to move on to another port without giving formal notice. Barnaby looked at her kindly, noting the slight tremor in her fingers and the quiet intelligence in her eyes. I must say, Mrs. Landry, I admire how well you manage your professional composure. You have not asked me once why an independent investigator is looking into a missing dock laborer. Peggy managed a faint, polite smile. I have always assumed that a private investigator prefers to keep his inquiries private, Mr. Jones. That is very considerate of you, Barnaby said with a gentle nod. Thank you for your help, Mrs. Landry. As Barnaby walked back toward his car, he took a mental note of the brand of typewriter resting on Peggy's desk. The typeface on the shipping forms matched the letter in his pocket down to the slightest alignment of the capital letters. The sender of the $195 was no longer a mystery, but the depth of her protective love for her husband was becoming clearer by the moment. Later that afternoon, Barnaby and JR visited the modest boarding house near 14th Avenue where John Stevens had rented a room. The building manager, a gruff man named Cooley with a ring of brass keys on his belt, led them up a creaking flight of stairs. Stevens was not the social type, Cooley explained, unlocking the door to a sparse room with a single iron bedstead and a dresser. Last Thursday morning, he walked right past my counter. I asked him about the past due rent, and he just laughed, told me he was coming into good fortune, and walked out the door. That was the last I ever saw of him. Did he have any regular visitors? JR asked, looking around the room. Cooley snorted. Only the sort of gentlemen who come around to collect on unfortunate gambling debts. Stevens would wager on anything with 4 legs or 2 wheels. Most of the time he lost, but every once in a while he would come into some money